Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Rohit Gandhi. Here we are kicking off a new year in democracies and dictatorships across the globe. As 2017 unfolds, we're going to be tracking stories that matter. As the world aspires to build societies that are just and equitable, one of the pillars of a healthy democracy is the ability for people to dissent and voice their protests. Protests tend to be seen as a negative thing, but in fact, they're catalysts for change. The governing must allow for the voices of the governed to be heard. Now, in December 2010, frustrated by the constant harassment meted out by municipal officials, a Tunisian street vendor set himself on fire, ending his life. It was an act of protest born out of exasperation and helplessness, but it ended up sparking the Jasmine Revolution, which in turn inspired the Arab Spring. 14 January marks 6 years since the movement in Tunisia. Our correspondent Manoj Keval Ramani takes a look at the impact of this regional movement for political change in West Asia and North Africa.
23 years of uncontested power gone in merely 28 days. This was the fate of former Tunisian President Zain Al Abidine Ben Ali. His ouster was the result of a series of protests that began after the death of Mohamed Bouazizi, a street vendor who immolated himself after a confrontation with municipal authorities in the city of Sidi Bouzid. It was not only the spark that spurred Tunisians to rally against a corrupt and repressive regime, but it also ignited regional movements. In January 2011, just days after Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia, protests erupted across Egypt. There were reports of cases of self-immolation and sporadic agitations. Egyptian activists and opposition groups seized the moment, harnessing the power of social media to mobilize citizens frustrated with the excesses of the Hosni Mubarak regime. January 25th, Egypt's National Police Day was symbolically chosen as the day for nationwide protests. Over the next few weeks, Cairo's Tahrir Square became the focus of the world's attention. A revolution was unfolding, despite the brutality of the state's crackdown. On February 11, 2011, Mubarak officially stepped down as president after having spent 30 years in power. Within a matter of days, pro-democracy protests erupted across a number of countries, from Libya and Morocco to Syria, Bahrain, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. But the outcomes were different in each of these countries, and they depended on a number of factors, such as the strength of the state institutions, the demographic and class breakup of the population, the role of Islam in society, and of course, geopolitical interests. In some cases, such as in Yemen and Libya, the agitations, along with the involvement of international actors, resulted in a change in leadership. But that has not meant a transition to secular liberal democracy. In other instances, such as Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, the leadership sustained, owing to a blend of hard and soft power, while offering minor concessions and casting the protests in the context of a sectarian and regional proxy war. And then there is Syria, where the state's heavy-handed response, coupled with competing geopolitical and sectarian interests, have resulted in a protracted conflict and fueled radical Islamist groups like the Islamic State. So how does one assess the success of these movements? If the goal was to establish secular liberal democracies in the region, then that clearly has not been attained. The only country moving in that direction today is Tunisia. But what the Arab Spring did do was that it took the academic debate over the compatibility of political Islam with liberal democracies to the real world. That perhaps is its greatest contribution to the political evolution of the region. In New Delhi, this is Manoj Keval Ramani, WION.
From history to present day, protests have taken various forms. People have done whatever it took to get the attention of the powers that be. WION's Raghavendra Rao reminds us of the different tactics that have been employed so far.
Why people protest is a question that has no simplistic answer. People forgo life's comforts, even risk their lives at times, all for the sake of a cause they believe in. This is something that has often intrigued observers and social scientists, but the different ways adopted by people to register their protests are no less intriguing. History is replete with examples of various kinds of protests. Be it Mahatma Gandhi's Khadi movement boycotting British cotton, to his civil disobedience and the Salt March, to his insistence on non-violence as a means of protest. Or the Montgomery bus boycott in the United States, which began after one Rosa Parks was arrested and fined for refusing to vacate a bus seat for a white passenger. Or demonstrations like the Tiananmen Square one, or the Occupy movements across the globe. Protests have often been the catalysts of change. Often identified with Mahatma Gandhi's peaceful ways of protesting, India has witnessed some shocking instances of protest as well. Images of 12 middle-aged women standing naked in front of Kangla Fort in Manipur's Imphal with a banner that read, "Indian Army, rape us," is still fresh in many a mind. Irom Sharmila's 16-year-long fast against the Armed Forces Special Powers Act in Manipur, or the ink attacks on Delhi's Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal are cases in point. Protest got a new form of expression when an Iraqi journalist hurled both his shoes at the then US President George Bush in 2008 during a live presser. Though Bush managed to duck both the shoe missiles, the message was not lost on anyone. A few months on, the episode found an echo in India when a journalist hurled his shoe at the then Home Minister P. Chidambaram. Nudity as an instrument has emerged as a major form of protest worldwide. An international group like Femin has chosen topless female activists painted with slogans and crowned with flowers as their weapon of protest against patriarchy. Then there are the likes of Tenzin Sundu, the Tibetan activist who chose to hide himself overnight in the balcony of the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore and emerge with a red banner that read, "Free Tibet." At the time, China's visiting Premier Wen Jiabao was addressing a conference at the venue in 2005. Protest methods like culture jamming, which, using existing media like billboards and posters, comment on those very media using their communication method, have also been gaining ground in some parts of the world. The forms may differ, but the philosophy running through all kinds of protests is more or less the same. It's a no, one which is not always communicated verbally. In New Delhi, Raghavendra Rao, WION.
Here we stand at the beginning of 2017, unsure of how this year will roll out. But 2016 was filled with all kinds of movements and agitations. Every month, literally every month, saw at least one protest somewhere in the world. Here's looking back at those defining moments in the past year and the ripples they caused. We're going to take a break now. When we return, we'll be joined by sociologist Dipankar Gupta and Vimlendu Jha, who's been part of various protests in India. I'm going to look at the power of protests in shaping democracies and overturning dictatorships. Welcome back to Democracy and Dictatorship. We are joined by Dipankar Gupta. He's a sociologist and an academic. Also with us is Vimlendu Jha. He's the founder of Swechha, an organization working for sustainable development and social change. Thank you both for being here. Let me start by asking you, Dipankar, what worked in Tunisia when we looked at and what didn't work in the Arab Spring?
Well, it's very hard to put a finger on it, but I think that in the Tunisian case, there was a popular resentment which was building up for some time, and they were able to pull it off in terms of it remaining non-violent right through, particularly because the state didn't come down with a heavy hand. To a certain extent, some people say it was not quite as threatened as other states in the Arab world was. But it is really quite remarkable that it stands out in that crowd. It will be very difficult to say why exactly, but in the case of Egypt, one is fairly certain what happened, and that is because there was an internal rift between the protesters, which was not quite the case in Tunisia. But you know, in protests of all sorts, everything may seem the same, and yet the outcomes are very different.
Sure.
For example, look at India and Pakistan. It was, some people say, the national movement, but the national movement took India towards democracy and Pakistan towards dictatorship.
It's certainly, so when we look at protests, they are legitimate so far as they stay non-violent, and as soon as they become violent, do they become illegitimate in some ways? They become mobs.
No, it's important for us to understand that why do protests take place, and also how actually it's very, very important for a good democracy to have a space for dissent and protest as well. Sometimes some governments, and we're talking about Russia, China, sometimes also the Indian government in many ways tries to look at dissent as being anti-national, or protest being a counter-narrative of nationalism in that sense. And that is something which actually defeats the larger idea of democracy. Protest is important, otherwise we all would just live like slaves.
When are we looking at context here? Is it the context and the culture that matters, and what's going to work or what's not going to work? Or is there like a blanket protest that may work and will be accepted by society, and some just will not be accepted?
Context is everything, there's no doubt about it. The most important thing is to win legitimacy and to keep it over a long period of time. That is the most important thing. Because there can be one kind of protest which is like a jackery, or it's a sudden outburst. Somebody has done dreadful things, people come on the streets, they burn houses, sometimes they burn landlords' fields, and things like that. The other is a protest which has a definite goal in mind. Let's say the independence movement here. I mentioned Kheda, Champaran, etc., etc. You might also throw in the JP movement, or you can look at the Chartist movement in Britain, the entire French Revolution and so forth. Those had certain specific goals in mind. And today, with the emergence of democracy and the general belief that democracy is everything, it's not a good idea to descend to violence, because that takes away your legitimacy right away, and you don't gain anything. Some people say that Gandhi was good, some people say it's bad. Others argue that without him, people might have got independence earlier. All that's very true. But the fact of the matter is that without Gandhi, we wouldn't have been a democracy.
100%.
We may have become independent earlier, whatever.
Sure.
So if you look at the history of movements, and I agree with them completely, that you must leave room for democracy. You can be called anti-national, but there was a time a few years back where if you said things about a corrupt administration, you were called anti-democratic,
Right.
which is also untrue.
Right.
Some of the most important advances in democracy, not all, but some, I'm thinking of the Chartists in particular in Britain, were movements outside the parliament. Often there were legitimate parliamentarians, siding with them. Or shall we take the suffragette movement? They happened outside.
Sure.
And if there's no room for that, maybe universal adult franchise would have been delayed by several more decades.
Sure.
So protest is there outside. Protest should be allowed inside. By inside, I don't mean taking over the well of the house, but there should be people who voice alternative opinions. But the outside and the inside must work not always in tandem, but they should certainly communicate.
Talking about violence and non-violence, a few years ago, I was with the Chin rebels just on the edge of Myanmar, and I was traveling with a 26-year-old girl who was part of the Chin rebels, and they were taking me across the border to their territory. I was with a group of 40 Chin rebels. They were all armed. And I looked at her and said, "You're 40 in total? Is that your whole force?" I said, "That's it." I'm like, "How are you going to fight the Burmese army if you're talking about fighting, such a large force?" She said, "I know we need a larger force if we were to physically fight it, but this is just a deterrent force. If we wanted to have a large-scale force, long term we'll never be a democracy. What will we do with these boys after we get independence?" And that containment was impossible for them, and they understood this early on, which helped them then.
There's been some discussion amongst philosophers, particularly, whether or not non-violence would work in, say, Nazi Germany. And they believe it wouldn't work. It would just be put away in concentration camps. But that's a big problem, in terms of political practice and theory. Where does non-violence fit in? Is it something that can work everywhere across time and space? Or is it something that works best in a democracy or in a government that aspires to be a democracy?
Some of these movements that have turned violent in history, and today as well, is also the fault of the state and the democracy, because democracy doesn't allow you to really protest non-violently, or your non-violent protest is actually not having the desired impact that it should have. So if someone is actually protesting for months together and is still disenchanted, is disenfranchised, then what does he or she do?
Hold your thought. Let's take a quick break now. Stay with us for more on the role of protests in shaping healthy societies across the globe. Welcome back to the show. We've been talking with Dipankar Gupta and Vimlendu Jha about the way protests make or break societies we live in. Now let's talk about discontent. It always arises out of a discontent in some ways. Now, how do you ascertain that the protests don't land up in the wrong individual's hand? Is there a way? Is there a check and balance?
No, it's not possible to do that. You see, as I said earlier, we have to distinguish between protests. One is to oppose somebody who's upsetting the given, the placidity of life. The other is when you're thinking of something larger outside of the given. So these are two different things. It's also very important what kind of leadership you have. Because if you look at the history of protest across the last 3 centuries or so, including, I would say, the levelers and the diggers of 17th century Britain, you'll find that always there's some people on top who control, give direction. And only when such leaders emerge does a protest consolidate. But paradoxically, most often, the leader doesn't belong to the led. That is the interesting thing. If you look at least all of the emergence of democracy as we know it to be, almost at every stage, you had a leader who wasn't part of the masses.
Having protests, is it a sign of a functioning democracy or a cracked one?
Absolutely. As in, if you don't have protest, then it's not democracy at all. Without protest, a democracy is worth nothing, because when we talk about policy making, when we're talking about voices to be heard, be it within the parliament or through other avenues. Because at the end of the day, democracy is not only about once in 5 years when you cast your vote and then you've actually surrendered your sovereignty to a political leader or to a particular government. It's also what happens between two voting cycles, and that's when the voices have to be heard. So I think if you look at historically, everything good that has actually happened, I won't say everything good that has actually happened is because of protest, but a lot that is actually happening, a lot of correction in our social, environmental, cultural norms and systems that have taken place not necessarily in our parliament, but actually on the streets. And streets lead to the parliament and policy making. So it's a very, very important, healthy phenomena in a healthy democracy to have protest.
So the reason why, may I add something to this?
Sure, please.
The reason is this, very simply, that if you think that you have arrived and whatever you had to do has been done,
Yes.
then I think you're heading not just backward, you're probably heading towards a very crusty form of leadership, which can border on autocracy. So all societies move forward, and the appreciation of this is very important. See, one of the reasons I think that Marx went wrong was because he put dialectic to a stop after the socialist revolution. You know, when he took the idea of dialectic from Fichte, and for Fichte, it was an ongoing process that goes on and on and on. You don't stop it at any point. Hegel was the one who stopped it, and Marx took over from him. So if anyone says my democracy is done and dusted, it's there, perfectly packaged, then it's disturbing. Democracies are always on the move, like everything else. For example, if you say that we are modern, and we have arrived, but no, tomorrow modernity may mean something quite different.
Yeah.
New elements may be added on.
Sure.
Likewise with democracy. Who thought in the 19th century that women should have the right to vote?
Exactly.
Who thought even in the 20th century that minorities should have the right to vote? Who thought till the other day that there should be something called gay rights? Today they are all,
Realities,
part of our system, and all that happened because of protests, because of the fact that democracy is a moving project. And as it is a moving project, protests, both internal and external, are par for the course.
But governments have cracked down on protests, and they've cracked down on protests sometimes in very, I would say, savvy ways from their perspective.
That's the unfortunate part,
Yeah.
because there are protests and protests, but at no point should a protest which is not breaking the law be curbed and dismissed.
Criticism of the state is not criticism of the nation. When I'm actually, and that's the scary part. There's a very organized system, and that actually, in Indian context, it actually started during UPA time. The previous government actually started listing organizations that they perhaps could in future ban, and that is very, very meticulously practiced by the current government right now in terms of finding out NGOs that speak up. What Russia, China, Pakistan, and India is speaking with is primarily to look at that, to really make civil society almost an arm of the government. So you should speak what the government wants you to speak and not be independent. And the same thing that is actually happening with media also in many parts of the world.
Today, if we look at protests, they've moved also from street to the online digital space. How much of a role is that playing today when it comes down to democratic movements and bringing people together?
I believe that the general verdict is that these things that happen on the internet play a very important role. I am, however, not very sure for a number of reasons. One is that the information on the internet is not always accurate. Most often is inaccurate. A lot of disinformation also is peddled by all quarters, by the way. The good guys and bad guys, they both do it. What it has done is that it has replaced rumor to a large extent. It has, of course, had one positive advantage, and that is of notifying people as to what is happening where and what we should do when. That is a positive advantage, something that newspapers would take a day to deliver. They can do it, instantly.
Yeah.
But other than that, one has to be a little careful in lauding the internet for his superior role in creating democracies.
I don't really agree totally on that point, because if you look at historically who had access to mainstream media and mainstream centers of power, it was only the powerful who could actually access that mainstream media. Today, it's anyone on the street who can actually go and tweet to the prime minister or the president of a country and solicit an answer, and more than once the prime minister or the person in charge actually responds. So there is some bit of democratizing of that entire communication, which was one way, which only came top down. There is some communication that is happening. At the same time, we look at how, when we talk about digital activism on its own cannot mean everything. Unless and until online is combined with offline, sure, there will not be a real impact. But there are some campaigns that are completely designed, as in the best example is of change.org. I've done several campaigns on change.org where we have only spammed through that digital campaign someone in power in the government, and we've been able to achieve things. But also it sometimes gives a false sense of activism and agency to people. You think you can save a tiger or a river by just RSVPing to a Facebook in terms of you like a Save the Tiger page and as if you've saved the tiger. No, saving the tiger actually means going on the ground and doing that ABC, which also need to do. So sweat with digital is where the real change is. Tunisia, Arab, many other places in the world actually was a combination of the two.
Sure. And that's what you were saying. We've got to be careful, the balance of what's done online and then what's done on the ground. It reminds me of class consciousness. Of a revolution can only be achieved once you reach that level of class consciousness to recognize that it doesn't exist within your society. Unless you have that, you cannot push class consciousness from the outside and you can create revolution. Thank you, Mlindu, for joining us for this. Thank you, Dipankar, for taking out time for this. The democracy in its truest form is utopia, but questioning and challenging the establishment is necessary for a healthy society. Over the years, protests have taken various forms and evolved as to create maximum impact. These movements are vital to the creation of a democratic space, but nothing is absolute.